how we measure the learning outcomes with the help of these Bloom's objectives, Bloom's taxonomical objectives. We also talked about how the Bloom's taxonomy has come to be revised later, according to Anderson and Krathwohl in 2001, and how Bloom's taxonomy is still being used in classrooms for the purposes of lesson planning as well as constructing evaluation questions. I also dealt briefly with the types of learning. Let me continue with the types of learning. We know that learning is proportional to the learning time is proportional to the length of the material. And the strength of the learning increases with the time that one gives for learning. That is, the increased time of learning, there is a possibility that one is able to learn more. We also know that verbal learning is very important because in the classroom, one acquires information and retains the information and is able to recall the information when it is given verbally. That is why we know from the previous days, from the older days too, we used to have the learner is mostly dependent on the teacher's lectures. Now we know that the verbal learning is a unique feature of human beings. We try to talk to each other. We try to involve in ourselves with the conversation. And it is generally by using the communication that we are able to learn. So various instruments like words, sounds, symbols, and also pictures and figures form an important part in while learning. Now, verbal learning is very important because in the classrooms, it is the teacher who socializes with the learner and makes them understand and asks them to communicate also by giving answers so that the student is able to develop his personality and he becomes more verbal and is also able to share his thoughts. It is here that the verbal learning is influenced by the meaningfulness of the content, the encouragement one is given, and the length of the content, and how much time encouragement the teacher gives to the learner. Now, we know that the learning is the permanent change in one's personality. And learning is also occurs because of the reinforced practice. That is, more practice gives rise to more learning. Now, according to the different theories of learning or different learning, we have either verbal learning, and we have different ways of methods of studying the features of verbal learning. One is having the paired associative learning. That is, there is some words, some what we call, when we are trying to learn in a foreign language, the help of a paired associates. That is, you can have something like CTY, which means lamp, KSX means silver. Now, the first one is a nonsense syllable, while the second one is a meaningful word. Now, the participant is presented with both the paired association and is asked to remember and recollect the meaningful word after presentation of the nonsense syllable. So, the number of trials that the person is involved to recollect all the meaningful words is the measure of the paired associative learning. That is, the syllable, the nonsense syllable along with the nonsense words, along with the sensible words are paired together, and later they're asked to, the students is asked to recollect the words. This helps to actually pair the words, and the association the student is able to recall later. Now, also there is something like serial learning. This is also a process involved in verbal learning. So how a person learns the words is he's now presented with a list of words and also nonsense syllables and instructed to remember them serially instead of the paired association. Now he's asked to remember them in a serial manner. Now it is required to recall the second word or nonsense syllable when first one is presented. So the first nonsense syllable is presented, the student is asked to recall the sensible word. Now the process continues until the participant recollects all the words in the given list. So this is in a serial manner. Instead of paired association, we require here the students learn in a systematic, straightforward manner. The free recall is a process where the experimental studies show that we organize the words in our memory. So here, we generally are given a list of words and the student is asked to recollect the words in any order. Generally, it is known that if you are given a number of words, say 20 words, and you're asked to remember them freely, write them on a piece of paper. Now, it is generally seen that the student remembers the first words and the last words, and there is a tendency for him to forget the middle words. So this is a free recall where the student is asked to recall on his own. So we are talking about the different types of verbal learning. So the verbal learning methods are either paired association or social learning or free recall methods. We're also talking about the social learning. What is social learning? We know that the persons learn from the societal features. That's why when a child is small, the parents are interested in sending to the school because he learns much more in the presence of his peers or with his teachers. Now, there is a educationist called as Albert Bandura, is an American psychologist, and he said that one learns through observation and imitation. That is why the children should be exposed more to the nature or to the more experiences so that the student, child is able to imbibe the knowledge from externally and internalize it. Albert Bandura says, we do not blindly respond to environmental stimuli. That is, we choose from the environment and make certain experiences our own. And this because we have certain insights and our decisions are based on our past experiences. So by vicarious or through observational learning also, we can incorporate them in our behavior. That is, by seeing directly something and by directly experience something, there is a possibility that we can retain it in our memories. So social learning does occur in the classroom, and this results, the social learning also results in behavior learning and also cognitive learning and also learning most about the environment. Now, this is important because when a person learns in social setting, he is able to get more memory, he has more attention, and he gets deeply involved, and therefore there is also motivation in the learning. So this is a particular behaviors especially are learned in the social settings. They cannot be learned remotely on in online classes. So certain behaviors, how to behave with other people's, your attitudes, values also get exchanged, and then there is interaction. All these are learned in the presence of the others. Now, what are the steps in social learning? We find that attention is the first step in the social learning. People pay attention to the teacher or to the other persons, and they imitate or they model their behavior based on the behavior of their parents or others in the society or their peers, etc. Now, attention is influenced by various factors. How do we remember more, or what draws our attention is there should be some distinctive features which actually draw the attention of the child to a particular person or to a particular incident or to a particular object. So the distinctiveness and the colorfulness and the complexity or the ability to draw one's senses or the sensory capacities, it all helps in retaining the matter for a longer time. And also attention is also important because sometimes reinforcement is there. Somebody says, if you do it, we'll give you, reward you something. Or if you do not do it, we'll be punishing you. Based on these reinforcers, which are either positive or negative, the student also pays attention to certain things. So in the social learning, attention is the first aspect, that is trying to focus on a particular aspect. Particular, maybe classroom learning, or maybe towards friends, or due to their distinguishedness, or something which actually catches their senses. Attention span is spent on certain event or certain object. The second is retention. When you learn something in a social setting, it is remembered for a longer time. This is the second step. And here, this is because the individual remembers the behavior, the images in his memory. Now, also the third is after retention, reproduction. If the student is able to, he's able to tell the same thing or draw the same thing, or is able to verbally talk about the same thing, then that is known as reproduction. That is, he's getting the image from his memory and he's trying to model whatever model behavior he has learned, he's trying to put or show it as his own. That is, his action is remembered and he's transferred into action after suitable analysis. That is, first, for anything to be reproduced, the individual has to pay attention. She or he has to retain it, and then he or she tries to put it as his own act, and that becomes the reproduction. Now, that means he has to accept that particular thing, and also he has to show the same thing in the environment. The next is, besides this aspects, it's motivation. If the student is motivated more in a social learning setting, he is able to do the things better. We find in a social setting in a classroom that some individuals are more motivated and some individuals are less motivated. So we know that in social learning, the motivation is also an important concept. So here we talk about what are the steps in social learning. One is attention. Second is retention, that is trying to keep something in the memory. And then one is reproduction, the third one, that is trying to put the same thing as his own, trying to copy it and also trying to mimic it and show it as his own behavior. And the motivation is also a factor which helps in developing the social learning. Now we know that an individual's personality is formed because of a person's personality and his behavior, and with environment as well as psychological processes are there through which one learning occurs, and all these will result in the person's personality. So a personality is not a unique thing. A personality develops, according to Albert Bandura, because of the interaction between environment, the person's behavior, and different psychological processes. So social learning is also very important because how we dress, how we actually mimic each other, how we actually try to speak, all this, how we try to display our knowledge, how we interact with others is based on seeing the other persons, and we try to behave in the same manner or in a similar manner. For example, how we dress or how we is dependent on our friends' dressing or maybe the societal norms, and how we talk maybe depending on how we interact social, maybe depending on our parents' guidance or maybe societal norms again. So all these are learned in social settings. Now this help in, based on observed behavior, we try to mimic or model their behavior in social settings. Now there is something called as social constructivism, which we talked about briefly. It was given by Vygotsky. Vygotsky is a Russian psychologist. He talks about the collaborative nature of learning. He says, we learn in society, but at the same time, there is a potentiality in us. Some things we learn on our own, but there is something at the age of around 13, we require guidance from our peers or elders or relatives maybe, who are much older to us and are able to guide us properly. Maybe some teachers too sometimes. They help us to develop our inner potentialities by providing proper guidelines. Now, it is not possible to separate learning from social context, he says. He says learning is trying to accumulate. It is not mere accumulation of knowledge or accommodation of new knowledge or skills, but we have to integrate it into the knowledge community through social interactions. Whatever knowledge we get, we have to apply it in our social settings too. So knowledge, for example, if you learn something, you work in an environmental, maybe you'll be working in an R&D organization, or maybe you'll be working in a college. But that means whatever knowledge you have acquired, it should be used in certain social contexts or in social interactions. According to Vygotsky, the social construction theory, every function in the cultural development of a child appears twice. That is, at the social level and at the individual level. That is, first is child learns something outside, and then he tries to apply it for himself. That is, at the societal level and at the individual level. According to cognitive psychologists, knowledge is constructed in response by the learners to interactions with environment. And Lev Vygotsky talks about the role of language and culture. It is not both language and culture to help in learning. Language and culture are the lenses through which the human beings can experience, communicate, and understand the world. Now, Vygotsky talks about learning as a collaborative process. That is, the learner has already reached a certain level of social development. Now, he also tries to solve problems independently, but at the same time, he also requires certain level of help. Now, to reach to a particular level of development, he has to have certain grooming or guidance by a teacher. And with the collaboration of the teacher or with his peers, the learner is able to learn more. Now, collaborative or group learning is a process where the peers interact with each other, and the learning is also structured by their interactions as well as by the guidance given by the teacher. Now, we were talking about motivation at different levels. According to behavioral psychologists, it is extrinsic, or it should be given from outside. The teacher or some elders have to give the motivation. Whereas in cognitive psychology, it is the what we call the learning or the motivation should be intrinsic. The motivation should come from inside. Now, in the social constructivism theory, motivation is both extrinsic as well as intrinsic. Now, Vygotsky also talks about the zone of proximal development. That is, here, the learner is capable of learning something more or reaching something to a higher level of learning, provided he gets the guidance from the teacher or an elder. Now, it is the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he can do with help. So collaborative or group learning is also a peer interaction method where the what we call sufficient motivation will be provided, but at the same time here we also require some constant guidance by the teacher which helps him to acquire new skills. So according to some behavioralistic psychologists, we are talking about the extrinsic motivation, but learning is also a social phenomenon which is motivated by rewards. Now, coming to the transfer of learning, there are different types of learning. What is transfer of learning? Transfer of learning occurs when a person's learning in one situation influences his learning in other situation. That is, his learning, whatever he learns in one situation, can be transferred or applied to a new situation. Now, this is the capacity of the individual to apply his knowledge or skills to a new situation. Now, there are different types of transfers of learning. For example, you have the positive transfer of learning. That is, if the transfer of knowledge is positive, if the previous learning helps the current learning. That is, for example, if we learn addition and multiplication, if we use it in some other like equations, learning equations, then that is known as whatever we learned earlier helps in the learning now. That is known as positive transfer of learning. Sometimes some learning actually interferes or it stops learning new things. For example, we have learned the word put, P-U-T is pronounced as put. But again, if you use B-U-T, you can't say put, you have to say but. So now here, the transfer, if you see the words P-U-T, you say put. But if you say B-U-T, again, if you try to say B-U-T, but, that means your earlier knowledge of put has come in the way of learning the new word, that is B-U-T. So there is a negative transfer of learning. This is a simple example, but there are certain, what we call knowledge or skills, where the previous learning may interfere with the new learning. And that becomes the negative transfer of learning. We also have zero transfer of learning. That is, nothing is facilitated or no new learning occurs. For example, if you want to learn guitar, if you know football, does it help in the learning of guitar? No, that is a completely different skill. So here, learning one art doesn't come in the learning of, it doesn't help the learning of another sport. So this is a completely different aspect or different skill, and therefore there is zero transfer of learning. Now, we know that the positive transfer of learning is very important for the performance of the student. That is, if there is a meaningful method by which the previous learning can be used to help new learning, that is known as the positive transfer of learning. That is, we can ask the student to know the similarities between the previously learned thing and the dissimilarities, and that helps to actually remember and also to overcome the influence of negative transfer. Also, sometimes we apply whatever we learn to the new situations or to our own life experiences. That helps in the positive transfer. If we avoid rote learning or learning by heart and develop the proper understanding of the content, that also helps in proper transfer of learning. And another important thing is sufficient time must be given to the students to learn something, because the more time you spend on something, the more study is given, the more you are able to learn. So proper sequencing of time is also important in the transfer of learning. There is something also called as mindfulness in learning. That is, if you use your mind or pay attention to learning, automatically you are able to learn more. That is, how much engaged you are with the subject matter also helps you to learn. Suppose you notice new things, or you find something which is very new or very novel to you, And if you try to understand it in its proper context or perspective, then you are able to remember it much better. Mindful learning is also important because it helps you to focus on certain contexts or learning situations. Then when you are completely absorbed in something, now that is what actually helps, because as UNESCO says, learning to learn is very important, and mindful learning helps you to understand what is the context of a particular learning, how to make it our own, and also it helps you to understand flexibly certain knowledge. Now, this is given by a Russian psychologist who says the more concentration the student gets, the easier the teacher's job is. Also, we have got Ellen Langer's traditional way of learning. Ellen Langer says, experiential learning can result in sometimes mindless behavior. Whereas when you try to think about it, using the teaching knowledge and using it awareness, it is possible to understand the things better. But generally in a classroom, all types of learning doesn't help. Some people have a separate type of distinctive features, types of learning. For example, some may be able to learn faster when presented with new material, whereas some may have different learning needs. Some may require from top down, that is, first you may start with the lecture method and then only they are able to understand. Some may actually try to experiment something and then learn, that is known as experiential learning. Whereas Langer says you have to have different approach, that is, you should go for a sideways learning, that is, try to adopt yourself to the situation, see that the mindfulness is developed by using different aspects of learning to different learners in the classroom. Of course, it's quite challenging because different learners in the classroom require different types of what we call learning motivation for learning. But at the same time, we have to understand that all learning is doesn't occur in the same way. Some may have lesser attention span, some may have more mindfulness in learning, some try to learn by experiences or observation, some have vicarious learning, that is by observation only they are able to learn. So the types of transfer of learning, which is more positive, will help the students to imbibe it for a longer time and become more knowledgeable and skillful. So we talked about the different types of learning in the sense, we talked about the verbal learning, the social learning, and that is learning that occurs in the social settings, and also the social constructivism, that is how the society tries to construct knowledge and how it has to be built stepwise in the student. And also we talked about the transfer of learning, and transfer of learning to take place, there should be congenial climate, the student should be understood well, and we should also see that there is meaningful learning and the similarities and dissimilarities are brought out to the best so that the student is able to learn. And accordingly, the life experiences and surroundings should also be brought into the classroom so that the student is able to apply the knowledge of what he has learned to the real life situations. And also the rote learning should be avoided and proper understanding should take place. Understanding will help in the better retention, and also sufficient time should be given for reflection and practice. If you try to teach in a hurry, it is possible that the students may forget the matter, study matter. So it has to be taught at leisure at the student's convenience. The next thing we'll be dealing with is memory and forgetting. We know that whatever knowledge we acquire or the experiences we gain or the skills we have is a part of learning. But at the same time, there is a tendency for us to retain it or to keep or store the material for a longer time in our brains, whereas sometimes we tend to forget. So learning without retention is not, it doesn't help us. Whereas storage is one aspect, that is storing in the brains, but the other thing is trying to get it at the proper time. That is, when we try to recollect it or retrieve it, we should be able to remember it. And this means when we are not able to retrieve the material, then it is no use for us. So the memory is the process by which we are trying to have the information which is stored in our brains brought to our use by trying to retrieving it. Now, memory refers to the retention or storage of acquired knowledge and trying to bring it back at a later stage. So there is a time gap between what we have learned something and what we try to remember or when we try to retrieve it. Now, see, if we are not able to remember whatever we have learned, then it becomes quite useless. We have to have certain knowledge of things of what we our prior experiences, and that means we should have proper memory. So the mental ability is to store our past experiences or learning, and so that we can reproduce it at a later stage or use it, and that becomes that mental ability becomes the memory. For consciousness sometimes after the experiences have occurred. That is, initially you have had some experiences, period of time, and that to what effect or to what extent you are able to remember them, that becomes the memory. It's generally seen that this memory is not a simple process. It is a very complex process, and also it involves storage and reproduction, but also many factors like how far you have learned it, how better you have learned it, what attention you have paid, or how are you able to retain it, that is retention. Sometimes somebody asks you to remember, have you seen this flower? You say, it is a rose. So first you try to recognize it and remember the name with which it is associated, that is, you recall it. Therefore, several processes are involved in the memory. That is retention, storage, recalling, and recognizing. And all these are dependent on some other factors like your motivation, your attention, and also no intervention from outside forces, no disturbance, and that helps you in better memory. Now, scientific studies have been done many, because we know that the students who have excellent memory are able to fare well better in education as well as in life. So memory is an important part. And Ebbinghaus is the first psychologist. He was there from 1850 to 1909. He studied memory process very scientifically. And he says nonsense syllables, he worked on nonsense syllables in memory. That is, he asked several people to remember the nonsense syllables in a particular order, in a serial order or paired associative manner. And then he tried to recollect how far this, people are able to remember. Now he says, when you remember something, when you try to remember something, now you may forget sometimes, but relearning occurs very fast if you have a memory. That is, memory is something like a saving method. And also there are many psychologists who says that the best method of teaching a new material, how best we can teach our students, how best we can see that our students can retain the material. Therefore, they said, some people said that the practice, if it is distributed, that is, it is given as chunks rather than one at a time. That is, when you try to teach for several hours, it becomes very cumbersome. Whereas if you try to teach in chunks or in periods of time, that is spaced learning, it is more effective. That is, Longman talks about this distributed practice for better memory. Some other scientists like Standing and others, Hebert, they have said that recognition is more accurate than recall. You can recognize certain things and from your memory, you can say, yes, I know that. Whereas recalling a particular name or event is more difficult. Now, if you come to memory, there are generally 3 stages by which the memory is retained in the brain. The first aspect of memory is encoding. Encoding is a process, that is, here we try to gain the information from through our senses about an environment, and we try to store it. Now, how it is stored? It is stored in the brain in certain chemical forms, and it is when the proper what we call stimulus is given, the same chemical is released between the nerve synapses or the nerve connections, and therefore we are able to again process it and say we are able to recognize or recall it. Now, encoding is the process of actually trying to receiving this sensory outputs, whatever knowledge you're getting, that is through all our senses, maybe our eyes, ears, and maybe tongue sometimes, skin, and all through these sensory organs, that information is stored in the brain. Now, this sensory input from the environment is transformed into a code, and this is stored in the memory, as I said, through chemical substances. Now, when it is transformed into a coded form, that is known as encoding. Now, for example, for anything to be learned, there should be some stimulus. Somebody should try to teach you something, or you should be interested in it, or there should be something to be learned. So this is known as the stimulus. Now, this stimulus is attended through our sense organs. We focus our attention on it, or we try to see it, observe it, or smell it, and therefore, then it is transformed into a code and stored in the brains. Now, encoding is very critical in the your memory process. Now, if something is encoded properly, then retrieval is easy. The next is storage. Storage is the second stage. Now, this means whatever is transformed, that should be kept inside the memory. Now, that is the maintenance of the stored information. This is because most of the time, some of the stored information may be there sometime at the back. New information is always being processed. So how far you are able to retain a particular fact that is obtained through sensory organs is dependent on the fact how powerful it is or how recent it is. So storage is related to retaining the information in the memory over a period of time. Now, this storage helps, how you store also helps in the retrieval process. Now, coming to the retrieval, this is the third stage where you can try to gain access to the stored information. How? By trying to, what you call, put it out or try to extricate it out, the information, whatever is coded, depending on the need. That is, whatever information is required, you should be able to put it out. That is, for example, if you have learned something, if you are supposed to write it in the exam, after the storage in the brain and after what we call encoding storage, the process would be retrieval. How far you are able to remember it or trying to extricate the information. Now, retrieval depends on storage, and that is how meaningfully you have understood something, then the easier it becomes to retrieve. Also, how properly it is stored, that also is important. So meaningful information is stored properly, or if it is practiced properly, there is a possibility that you are able to understand it properly, you are able to retrieve it better. So these are the three stages, that is encoding, storage, and retrieval. All of them are interrelated. Now, we know that we try to remember several things and our memory is there, and we try to record all our experiences of learning. But when we try to actually get something from our memory, it is not completely accurate. There may be certain disturbances or something which we do not try to get the same information in the same correct manner. So memory loss is also a very normal process. So also sometimes inaccuracy of memory occurs because we do not store the information properly. Or sometimes there is a problem with retrieval. We are not able to get the information again in a proper manner. Now, if we understand the different types of memory, we have about 3 types of memory. Basically, one is the sensory memory. Now, when we get the information about the environment through our sensory organs, that is known as the sensory memory, it is very immediate, but it's also very temporary memory. And the capacity of sensory memory is very large, but the retention is very brief. It may be for a few seconds or maybe fraction of seconds sometimes. That is visual information. And if you see something and try to remember through words, it may be for a few seconds. And also, when you try to use the sensory memory, you have to see that the information is again given to you. That is, for that becomes the short-term memory. So sensory memory is very brief. Whatever we get the knowledge, it comes as a perception, or a few brief minutes you see something is shown to you, or people talk to you verbally, or maybe a class. But maybe after 24 hours, you find nearly about 30% of the memory is lost unless you try to read through it or try to understand or try to go through it in a proper manner. That is, one should put in an effort to understand. So here the teachers is only trying to instigate a sort of motivation the children for their own learning, but it's the children who should again practice or revise it or learn it mindfully so that they are able to retain the knowledge for a longer time. In our daily life, we depend on our sensory memory because we have to remember the information for a very short time. But then, if we want to remember something for a longer duration, now that would take special effort. For example, if you see a red light, you are able to immediately take action and stop. and if there is some green light shown in the traffic signal, you're able to move forward. That is just a simple sensory memory. From your memory, you know, you have to stop and you have to go. It occurs very briefly. But if you want to understand, you are going through the process now and again, you know, you're able to stop automatically. This is because it becomes incorporated into the short-term memory. Now, when we make an effort to concentrate on particular sensory information and practice over it, then that information enters the short-term memory. The short-term memory is also a very temporary memory. That is, we are conscious of the information, we are trying to store it for a shorter periods of time. For example, if somebody asks you to remember a telephone number or a brief time, you're able to remember it. But you're able to remember a telephone number of your own child or parent. That is because you've gone into the long-term memory. But short-term memory, remembering a phone number of an acquaintance for say a brief 15-20 minutes, that would be short-term memory. So without rehearsal, the short-term memory may also be forgotten. It is generally about 20 to 30 seconds sometimes. Rehearsal or repeating the information may help you to retain the short-term memory for some time. According to many researchers, the short-term memory capacity is very limited. And now it may be, you can remember about 7 to 2 or about 11 facts, 7 to 9 facts, 7 plus 2 facts, maybe 9, around 9 facts in the short-term memory. Whereas in the sensory memory, you can remember, but a brief time you're shown something and taken away, you're able to remember, but it is all, the sensory memory is also for a very limited time. Whereas the long-term memory, now here it make a conscious effort to retain the information, and you can store lots of information in the long-term memory. Now, this is a permanent memory. Now, again, this long-term memory, we are able to retain over a longer periods of time because we have made certain connections within them, and we are able to process the information and store it in a proper way so that we are able to collect the information over a period of time. Now, this long-term memory can be of two types. One is episodic and the other is sensory. Episodic is how we try to relate something to ourselves, that is autobiographically, and remember them as experiences or episodes. Whereas the semantic memory deals with the facts, knowledge, information, and concepts about our surroundings. Now, if you want to test your long-term memory, there are certain questions asked, like what is your mobile number, Aadhaar number? These you are able to recollect because they have gone to the long-term memory. Or for example, if you want to find out who has written the national song, or what is our national anthem? What is the capital city of India? Now, these are retained in the brain because you have gone through them again and again. That information is there in the long-term memory. So here, there are certain questions which are able to, you are able to get them, retrieve them quickly, whereas for some it takes time. So even for long-term memory, there is a possibility that unless you use them, they may subside, they may be lost. Also say there is something given by Atkinson and Schifrin who talk about the working memory. The working memory is something where we are using it in day-to-day life. Now, this is also using both the short-term memory and also the sensory memory. Maybe we're also using a bit of our long-term memory, so that memory is helping us to get things done. Now, working memory is an important part in learning and processing of information. Suppose something is being taught. Now you try to retain something from whatever you have learned from your long-term memory. You're also seeing and learning sensorily, and you're also trying to recall short-term information. Now, all this, if you're asked to put into a project or into an assignment and write immediately, now you make use of all these things. Now, the ability to work with information is known as the working memory. That is, here we are working with certain information, and based on that information, we are making decisions. And we are also trying to ignore the unrelated factors and take only the relevant factors and trying to remember them and trying to get the problem solved. Now, this is our brain's conductor. It helps us to prioritize things and process the information and allows us to ignore the irrelevant information. For example, if you are asked to write answer to a question in your examination, then you won't be thinking about your whatever movies you have seen the earlier day, or what message you have given to your friend on WhatsApp, but more often you are focused on the relevant information, how to present it. Now that becomes the working memory. Now this also helps you to hold on to information and allows you to work in a particular context with the information given. Now this helps us to actually achieve certain goals. It works according to certain goals, and it also helps you to work towards a particular goal. Now, this problem with the working memory is it is very limited in capacity, and it helps you to work when you are given new information. It is not, when new information is provided, doesn't work very much, but when you are provided, when you have much acquaintance with the knowledge, you are able to use that knowledge, and that knowledge, whatever long-term knowledge you have had about that issue, helps you to work better. Now, even the working memory is very limited in capacity and duration. Now, this is very important because it helps you to deal with unfamiliar situation. Whatever knowledge you have had, that you are trying to use to your unfamiliar situation and trying to get solutions. And whatever is not relevant to that particular situation, you're avoiding. So whatever information is there, that is being processed and being used to the best of your ability to a particular situation. Now that becomes the working memory. Now we can briefly compare between the different types of memory. Sensory memory contains all the information that is obtained through the sense organs, and the retention is very less. It is about 2 to 3 seconds. And the span of sensory memory is about 11 to 13 items you can remember for a short time, that is 2. And the short-term memory is the ability to remember information for a shorter period of time, but it is better than sensory information. Here, it is not fraction of a second, but for a few seconds. And the short-term memory may last up to 30 seconds, and it may last indefinitely, provided you provide rehearsal. If you go on rehearsal, the short-term memory may be retained for a longer time. The span of short-term memory is about 9 items. That is, if you're briefly sure about some say 20 items for a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds, and then taken away, there's a possibility that you'll be able to retain or recollect about 9 items. So short-term memory with practice can be developed, and then it can form a part of long-term memory. Long-term memory is the memory that you can, it is the ability to remember information from a few days to few years. Some people have good memory. This is because they are able to actually have good long-term memory. Long-term memory is the accumulation of knowledge and information over a period of time, whereas the working memory is the ability to act on information, or the ability to do something with the information that is provided and just not remember the information. So if you are able to work on it, that becomes the working memory. Working memory is very important because although it is limited in capacity, you can deal with unknown or new information, and also you're able to process the information within the given time, and your capacity becomes unlimited, especially in familiar knowledge or with familiar situations, you are able to process it more, because long-term memory, that is whatever information you stored over a long period of time, that helps you to actually help to get the things done, and therefore it helps in the working memory. Now, how do we improve memory? We know that in the memory itself, there's also the possibility of forgetting something. So some people try to remember many things because memory is required not only in exams, maybe in daily life, and also especially much good memory is required in many national, international activities too. So here, depending on how good a memory you have got, different jobs profiles are also given. And now we have got many types of ways of remembering memory. They are known as mnemonic, what you call symbols, or mnemonic means trying to remember something. We have got certain ways of remembering them. One of the ways is using the first letter technique. That is, for example, if you want to remember all the colors in the rainbow, it is called as VIBGYOR. What is VIBGYOR? Violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red colors. So it's very difficult to remember all the colors. Therefore, you say VIBGYOR. Similarly, for organization, we use as postcard. What is postcard? Dealing with planning, organization, etc. Now, all these combined together, they become a first letter technique. That is, you can remember all the things related by using a single word or something like an acronym, you can try to remember all the first words, first word or first letter in a word and combine them and try to remember them. Also, sometimes we can use the process of chunking. That is, whatever is the information is there, if it is very big amount of information, that can be stored as small chunks, and then it can be stored in the long-term memory. This means the information has to be broken down. Now, chunking is very important because it helps the capacity of short-term memory. That is, the short-term memory you can use in chunks of knowledge. You can try to remember it, rehearse it, and then keep it in the long-term memory. Also, there's something called as the Loci method. What is the Loci method? That is, one tries to imagine or remember something by placing themselves in a place or in a particular environment, where being in a particular place or going around or moving around, they try to associate certain things with it. This is very useful to remember. That is, they visualize the places they're familiar with and they associate the information with the places or the physical locations. And this movement or a mental walk through all these different places in a serial order also helps them to remember the things visually. Now, this memory is a very complex process, and all these mnemonic or trying to remember strategies, they help to remember simple information in our day-to-day life. Now, this also, there are some other ways of remembering, but these require time. That is, the memory improves with provided you have a deep level of processing. That is, how much time you give to a particular thing. For example, if you try to understand a situation with what has been done, who has done it, how it was done, when it was done, why it was done. Now, all this related information, if you process it, that can be stored in the brain for a longer time. That is, here we are trying to focus on the meaning or the interrelationship between various components and trying to understand them in all their intricateness and also focusing on them. And therefore, you can remember it for a longer time. That is, there is a much more deeper processing. Now, this is known as deep level processing. Also, we have to see that there is no interference from the outside environment, because avoiding interference means you are able to retain the matter for a better time. That is, we should see interference can be avoided by seeing that similar materials should be studied in a sequence. Also, there should be proper breaks between the study sessions. Now, this helps in better retention. Also, interference from outside noises or other things, or trying to not get distracted through some other medium like what we call social media or through TV. Now, all these disturbance factors are avoided. There is a possibility there is much more focus. And if you try to manage the interference, you're able to retain it for a longer time. We also know that the practice makes perfect. Most of the time, with how much practice you put into the short-term memory, that will be retained much better into the long-term memory. Also, we know that if the information is studied at leisure rather than in a hurry before the exam, it is possible that you are able to retain it much better. Also, proper repetition, as they say. As I said earlier, most of the information is lost, say about 30% by the end of the day, and nearly about 70% about 2 days after what we have learned something. Therefore, going through it, if the say within 24 to 48 hours over the subject matter, will help in better retention. And a frequent repetition also helps. That is why they say practice makes a man perfect. Also, understanding the things in all their interrelationship, and having a proper diet and having proper sleep and proper exercise, and also having a positive and mental attitude, all these will help in better memory. Stress and also being not able to sleep early or having insomnia or not having enough sleep, insufficient sleep, lack of proper diet, lack of proper exercise, because even our brain cells require oxygen. All of these mean with no oxygen, no sleep, no exercise, it is possible that this memory is also lost, and the memory becomes here very episodic, or sometimes it becomes spasmodic, and that you are not able to recollect the things when and how you want. When we talk about memory, we also should talk about forgetting, because the forgetting is the counterpart of memory. Forgetting is a natural phenomenon. It is so because our sense organs have to process with no information, and whatever is not required is just thrown to a side, or the whatever is practiced more, the nerve synapses, they try to retain the chemicals more, or they are more recent, whereas the unused material or unused skill or unused knowledge tends to get lost. So forgetting is a natural process through which our brains try to accommodate and also try to live up to the new situations, or try to able to get or learn new things. So memory is a part of learning. And forgetting is also a part of learning. According to Mann, forgetting is the loss. Sometimes it may be temporary, sometimes it may be permanent, but it is the loss of the ability to recall or recognize something, but that which has been learned earlier. So whatever we have learned earlier or what we have experienced, if we fail to recognize or recollect about it or retain it, now that is known as forgetfulness or forgetting. That is, either at the encoding stage or at the storage stage, there is some problem and the learner tends to forget. Now, why do we forget? This is because the information is neither stored properly, nor recorded properly, nor it is, sometimes even if it is recorded or encoded, it is not, we are not able to retrieve it properly. There is problem with retrieving. Generally, we find that there are two types of forgetting. One is general forgetting. That is, we tend to forget about the whole thing, whereas the previous completely, there is a loss of previous learning. That is because we have not been practicing it. Sometimes we call about specific learning. That is, we remember something, but we forget something. Something is specifically lost. Another view is that physical or psychological reasons may contribute to forgetting. What are the physical reasons? Old age, or having certain diseases, some viral diseases, also being what we call subject to certain accidents or injuries to brain, consumption of alcohol or drugs, long-term consumption of intoxicating materials, malfunctioning of the central nervous system because of all these, or maybe due to certain internal reasons, internal metabolic conditions. Now, these may be resulting in the physical reasons of forgetting. Whereas the psychological factors may be anxiety, if you are full of tensions, or maybe you have a stressful life, or you do not have sufficient interest in the information, or you try to deliberately forget because you have experienced certain pain with it, that becomes psychological factors. All these are the psychological factors by which we forget. There are several theories of forgetting. One of them is the trace decay theory. In this trace decay theory, here we are not using the information falls into disuse, and therefore we are unable to retain the information or recollect it at proper time. Now, when we have learned some skill, but we are not able to use it for a longer time. For example, you have learned a musical instrument, but you have not been practicing it for a longer time, then it may fall into your head, and there's a possibility that you may forget something. But the problem with this is short-term memory, where practice is not enough, may help you to forget. But then when you try to understand something like a swimming or driving or what we call riding a bicycle, here you are able to remember it even after some time. So the trace decay theory does not work here. The next is interference theory. Interference theory is sometimes there is what we call interference from the knowledge you have learned earlier. For example, there are two types of inhibition of knowledge. This is interference occurring. Now, this interference, for example, you have learned something, new information, you have already learned something, but now we want to learn new information. But whatever new information you are learning is completely different from what you have learned earlier. So the new information interferes with the recall of the previous information, whatever you have learned. And that is known as proactive inhibition. Whereas retroactive inhibition is you have learning something now, but whatever you have learned earlier is coming in the learning of today's knowledge. That becomes the retroactive. Whatever you learned earlier comes in the way of learning whatever you're learning now. That becomes the retroactive inhibition. Or whatever you have learned is not learned because of, for example, again, I'll repeat, in proactive inhibition, the acquisition of new information interferes with the recall of the previous information. Whereas if the old information interferes with whatever you're learning now, that is known as the retroactive inhibition. Now we know that similar experiences, if we are trying to follow each other, they produce sometimes confusion, resulting in forgetting. So whenever the knowledge is not taught in a meaningful manner, or whenever there is confusion even while learning, there is a possibility that this interference may result in the memory loss as well as obviously in forgetting. Also, sometimes we talk about abnormal forgetting. We do not know for no reason we forget. This theory is not able to account for it. Now, the repression theory is one more thing. Freud talks about the repression theory, where he says, whatever we do not like, we try to repress it, and automatically we tend to forget about it. Suppose there is a person or is a particular event, or you want to avoid someone, then because you do not like them, in such a case, you tend to forget about it. For example, you want to attend a function, but then you are not interested because you do not particularly like that person. There's a possibility that even though you feel like attending for a minute, you tend to forget it over a period of time. That is, when you do not like a person, there's a tendency for you to forget about it more. So here, whatever we do not like, whatever painful memories are there, we are unconsciously or consciously, we try to ignore them intentionally, and automatically it goes into the background and it becomes repressed. So this is one of the reasons. Also, apart from this, there is also excessive disturbances caused due to stress. If you are more stressful, there's a possibility that you tend to forget more things. That is why people under stress or duress, they forget about things. And also sometimes there are failure to recall the answers in the exam hall because again, you are stressed out, or anxiety may be there. Or in an interview, you are able to recall the answers or retrieve the answers, because although you may be knowing, that is because here there is a forgetfulness which is arising due to fear. So here in this chapter, we have learned something about memory as well as forgetting. We know memory is the ability to store and get the information at our what we call, whenever we would like, we try to retrieve the information, that becomes the memory. Memory has three aspects to it, that is encoding, storage, and retrieval. We also talked about the different types of memory we have, that is the short sensory memory, the short-term memory, the long-term memory, and the working memory. The counterpart of memory is forgetfulness. There are different theories accounting for forgetfulness. At the same time, although we understand about forgetfulness, it is the most important part of this thing would be focusing on the improving memory, or the mnemonic type of strategies, that is trying to have certain strategies with which we can improve the memory. We talked about the first letter techniques, or the chunking of information, and also using the Loci method, or having some visual type of remembrance, or sometimes to understand or to retain the information over a longer period of time, we should have deep level of processing. And also we should try to see that there is less of interference, and through practice and through proper diet, exercise, and also having a peaceful style of life, and having proper positive mental attitude, and trying to retain, or good sleep, and all these factors would help in better memory. With this, we would come to the end of the chapter on learning. We have dealt briefly with Piaget's theory, the different types of learning, and memory and forgetfulness. In the next chapter, we will be dealing with something broader, that is on the curriculum. What are the different types of curriculum we have? How learning is made possible through constructs called as the school, and how school and curriculum help in learning aspect, and how curriculum should also see that diverse features are incorporated into it, so that our learning becomes meaningful, especially in the societal context, because education is not learned alone by a person alone, but learning occurs in society. Learning is a social construct. So whatever you learn occurs in the society as well as is used in the society, as this human being is a social animal. So here, the curriculum or whatever we try to incorporate all the experiences in the school or in the college, depending on the national or social goals, becomes important. And it is here we try to understand more about the Indian context of the curriculum and the curriculum in diversity and how curriculum helps in learning. All these factors we'll be learning in the next class. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.